My husband transferred my $8 million inheritance to a charity his mistress runs. They mocked me publicly. A month later, I gave them front row seats to their own exposure. He asked, "Why are people booing?" I whispered, "Because they know everything." My name is Serena Elwood. I'm 44, and if you'd asked me 5 years ago what my life would look like, I would have told you I was safe, maybe even lucky. I had a strong marriage, at least, I thought I did, a respected family name in Charleston, and a quiet life in the historic home I'd inherited. I wasn't flashy or loud. I hosted garden luncheons, I ran a modest online vintage business from home, and I volunteered at the local library. My husband, Brennan Ashcroft, was the star. People loved him. He was a trial lawyer, silver-tongued, polished, always in a three-piece suit even when it was 98 degrees. He had this way of talking where you felt like you were the only one in the room. When we met, I was instantly drawn to that charisma. He seemed like the anchor I didn't know I needed after my father passed. But the thing about charisma? Sometimes it's just a cover. It began the way most tragedies do, quietly. My mother passed from cancer, and not even a year later, my father followed. The grief was heavy, and I wasn't thinking clearly when I made Brennan co-trustee of the estate. It felt logical. He was already handling the tax side of things. And I was still in the fog of burying 2 parents. We'd been married 9 years by then. I had no reason to think he'd do anything underhanded. He was my husband. The estate was valued at just over $8 million, between the family home, my father's art collection, several trust funds, and some antique investments. I thought we'd use it to set up something meaningful in my parents' name, maybe a scholarship or something for the Historical Society. That was the plan. That's what I said out loud. Brennan smiled and said it sounded beautiful. He said a lot of things that sounded beautiful. Over the next year, there were signs. Not big ones. Not flashing neon betrayals. Just small shifts that, in hindsight, should have made me stop everything. He started working later. At first, I thought it was trial prep. But then he'd go to meetings on Sundays. He started traveling again, always for conferences, but he stopped asking me to come with him. I didn't ask questions, because part of me didn't want to know the answers. Around the same time, I noticed the accounts were harder to access. He'd changed the passwords for security, and I let it go. When I asked where the money from one of the matured accounts had gone, he told me it had been reinvested into a long-term tax shelter. Again, he said it so smoothly, so confidently, that I didn't think twice. But what really snapped me out of my daze was a dinner. We were at a restaurant on King Street, high-end, dimly lit, filled with Charleston's usual elite. Brennan had been in a strangely good mood. That should have tipped me off. He casually mentioned a foundation he was helping out. Said it was for absed women, that a colleague of his from law school had started it and he'd been mentoring her. Her name was Delaney Pierce. I'd never heard of her before. I remember sipping my wine, nodding, and saying, "That's really generous of you." He smiled at me, this crooked little smirk, and said, "Well, it's your generosity, really." I laughed at the time. I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. 2 months later, we were invited to a gala in Savannah. It was hosted by her Light Foundation, the very same one Brennan had casually mentioned. He insisted we go. Said it was important. I wore my mother's emerald necklace and a navy blue gown Brennan had picked out a year before. When we arrived, the venue was packed. All the usual people were there, lawyers, donors, even a few minor celebrities. Brennan was glowing. I thought it was pride. About halfway through the evening, a woman took the stage. Tall, stunning, with long black hair and a figure made for red carpets. She wore a red dress that looked eerily familiar, because I owned it. Or I used to. She introduced herself as Delaney Pierce, founder of her Light Foundation. And then she said it. In front of everyone. "We owe everything to our largest benefactor, Mr. Brennan Ashcroft." His commitment, his financial support, his vision, this organization would not exist without him. People clapped. Brennan stood and gave a small wave, the way people do when they pretend to be modest. Delaney smiled at him like they had a private joke between them. My stomach sank. I looked at Brennan. He leaned in and whispered, "You always wanted to help women. I just made it happen faster." I don't remember how the rest of the night ended. I just remember the taste of champagne going sour in my mouth. The next morning, I tried to log into our shared estate account. I was locked out. I called the bank. They informed me that the account had been transitioned into a charitable trust, with co-trustees Brennan Ashcroft and Delaney Pierce. My name was no longer on it. $8 million. Gone. I didn't cry. Not then. I sat at the kitchen table in the house my grandfather built with his own hands and stared at the black and white photo of my parents on their wedding day. And I said out loud, "I'm sorry." And then I got to work. I wasn't trained to handle betrayal like this. I didn't grow up around liars and frauds. My parents were straight-laced, honest people who didn't even keep secrets about birthdays. But something inside me switched on. A survival instinct I didn't know I had. I wasn't going to let this end with me being the fool in the corner while Brennan and Delaney sipped champagne on my dime. First, I stopped talking to Brennan. No fights. No yelling. I just went quiet. And I think that rattled him more than anything. He'd come home, toss his keys on the counter like nothing was wrong, and start monologuing about some trial he was prepping for or how exhausting the gala had been. I'd nod. Smile. Ask if he wanted tea. I didn't let him see me unravel. I didn't let him see what I was doing behind the scenes. My first call was to a woman named Maura, a friend of my father's who had worked in estate law for decades. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "You need a forensic accountant. And you need one yesterday." So I got one. His name was Wesley Lamb. Early 50s, dry humor, smart as HLL. He'd worked with the IRS before going private. I gave him every file, every paper trail, every scrap I could find. Bank statements, receipts, emails. I even forwarded him Brennan's calendar invites when I found out he still had them synced to our home computer. Within 10 days, Wesley found everything. Brennan hadn't just moved the inheritance. He'd forged my digital signature on the trust transfer documents. He'd created false approval letters with my name at the bottom. All of it so clean, so meticulous, that if I hadn't started digging, I never would have known. And Delaney? She wasn't just a mistress or a con artist, she was running a full-blown fraud operation. Less than 5% of the funds donated to her Light Foundation were being used for actual programs. The rest was going into luxury travel, designer clothing, marketing expenses, and monthly wire transfers to a private bank account in the Cayman Islands. Every transaction, Wesley tracked. Every lie, he flagged. And the more I uncovered, the calmer I became. Because now, I wasn't angry, I was ready. Now, the public exposure? That took planning. I didn't want to go to court quietly. I didn't want this to be a headline on the legal page. I wanted people to see them for what they were, without me having to scream it. So I called Julian Morrow. He was a documentary filmmaker in Charleston, known for his work exposing corporate corruption and shady political dealings. I'd met him a few years ago at a charity auction, and he'd once mentioned he wanted to tackle the topic of financial abs, specifically how women, even educated and wealthy ones, often get financially blindsided in relationships. I told him I had a story. We met at a cafe. I slid a flash drive across the table. He plugged it into his laptop, and within minutes, his eyebrows were raised. "You want this public?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And I want them to feel it." We worked quietly over the next 3 weeks. Julian and his editor stitched together the footage with timelines, bank data visuals, and anonymous interviews. It was all factual, documented, and legally sound. He blurred their faces initially, changed the names, and framed it as a story about a Southern couple's charitable deception, but it would be clear to anyone watching who it was really about. Then came the final piece, the event. I booked the Charleston Arts Hall under the guise of a fundraising event for ethics and philanthropy. Brennan received an invitation with a fake foundation name listed on the front. So did Delaney. We made it look like a recognition night for donors who had made lasting contributions to women-led charities. They RSVP'd within 2 hours. That night, I stood in the lobby in a black satin dress, hair pulled back, no jewelry except my mother's watch. I greeted guests, shook hands, smiled. People who knew me from the community gave me tight, curious looks. They'd heard rumors. They didn't know the whole story. Yet. Brennan and Delaney showed up just before the lights dimmed. He was in a navy tux. She wore gold. They looked smug. I offered them front row seats. They took them. The documentary began. It opened with a quote, "Trust is built in drops and lost in buckets." The first 10 minutes were anonymous testimony. General talk about financial manipulation. Slowly, it unfolded, the dates, the wire transfers, the trust names. Bank account overlays. Expenses labeled business travel that were really spa getaways and private jets. Then, came the moment. The faces unblurred. Delaney's voice. Brennan's signature. Their emails. Their selfies from Morocco with captions like "Changing the world, one mimosa at a time." The room was dead silent. Then came the murmurs. I stood in the back. People were turning in their seats, whispering. Delaney leaned over and hissed something to Brennan. He looked pale. He shifted uncomfortably. Halfway through the film, someone near the front muttered, "Is this real?" A man in the second row said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's Brennan. I know his voice. That's him." And then the booing started. Not loud. Not wild. Just this slow, steady murmur of disbelief and disgust. One woman actually stood up and left, shaking her head. Brennan leaned back in his seat, visibly sweating. He turned his head slightly toward me, confused, almost dazed. And in the softest voice, he asked, "Why are people booing?" I took 2 slow steps forward, leaned down just enough so he could hear, and whispered, "Because they know everything." Then I smiled. And walked away. I didn't stay for the rest of the documentary. I'd seen it enough times in the editing room, and honestly, I didn't need to hear the commentary or relive the voiceovers explaining the depths of the deception. I walked out through the side door of the Charleston Arts Hall and into the cool evening air. The humidity was low that night, rare for March, and the city had that faint saltwater smell from the harbor. I stood on the sidewalk in front of a little bakery that had closed for the night and just breathed. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt like I wasn't drowning in silence. I hadn't screamed, thrown plates, or torched his car like part of me once fantasized. I'd simply told the truth, and let people see it. But just because the truth was out didn't mean it was over. That was just the start. The next morning, my phone didn't stop buzzing. I had messages from neighbors, acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them were just stunned. Others were furious, angry that they'd ever donated to her Light Foundation, angry they'd praised Brennan or worked with him or reposted Delaney's motivational speeches. One woman, Jillian, I think, left a voicemail saying, "He used my story. I told him about my ex, and he used it in his opening statement at a fundraiser. Said it inspired him. I feel sick." The press caught on by that afternoon. Julian released the documentary online, uncut, names unblurred, fully attributed. His legal team had gone over it carefully, and every single claim was backed by documentation. By evening, the Charleston Gazette and the Post and Courier were both running digital headlines: "Local charity scandal, high-profile lawyer and mistress accused of inheritance fraud." The next few days were chaos. Brennan tried to do damage control. He issued a public statement claiming mismanagement and miscommunication. Delaney doubled down on Instagram, calling the film an exaggerated smear campaign created by a bitter woman. But that didn't go over well. Comments were brutal. Every post she made was flooded with people posting clips from the documentary or screenshots of donation records. Her foundation's website went offline by day 3. By day 5, they both lawyered up. And I was already 10 steps ahead. While the public was reacting, my legal team was quietly filing charges. Civil court, not criminal, yet. But we had enough evidence for both. The main priority was recovering the assets. And Wesley, my forensic guy, had mapped out exactly where everything had gone: property under Delaney's name in Atlanta, a BMW registered to a shell company, multiple business-class flights labeled as legal research, and a joint offshore account under a trust called Light Horizons Holdings. The judge didn't need convincing. We were granted an injunction almost immediately. That meant they couldn't touch the money. Couldn't move it, hide it, spend it, or launder it. Their accounts were frozen within 72 hours. I don't think Brennan ever expected me to fight back. I don't think he knew I could. He once told me I was too gentle for courtroom work. That's the irony. I didn't need to be in court to bring him down. I just needed people to see. One of the most surreal moments came a week later. I was walking through the Harris Teeter on East Bay Street pushing my cart in the frozen aisle, when a woman I barely knew, someone I'd seen at church functions or art showings, stopped me. She just looked at me for a second, then said, "You were so calm. I don't know how you did it." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She kept looking at me, like she expected more, and then finally said, "You didn't just survive him. You undressed the lie." And then she walked away. I wish I could say Brennan disappeared quietly. But no. He fought back the only way he knew how, legally and loudly. He filed a countersuit, claiming I'd defamed him. That the funds were donated in good faith and that I'd agreed to the setup verbally. He even tried to play the angle of being the one emotionally manipulated. It was laughable. His lawyer was new, someone from out of state, probably the only person willing to represent him after every major Charleston firm backed off. Delaney stayed mostly out of sight, though she posted cryptic quotes on her socials for a while, stuff like "Only God can judge me" and "You don't know my side of the story." Eventually, even those posts stopped. When the court dates were set, Brennan's demeanor shifted. He stopped showing up in tailored suits. He looked tired, bloated. He tried to settle, quietly, but by then it was out of his hands. Multiple donors to her Light Foundation were now pressing charges. A few of them were prominent enough that the district attorney's office took interest. I didn't even have to press for criminal charges. They were doing it for me. Behind the scenes, my home life was quiet, eerily so. The Elwood estate was suddenly both a refuge and a reminder. Every time I passed my father's study, I remembered the day he taught me how to read contracts, his finger following the lines slowly, making sure I never missed the fine print. "People hide their lies in the fine print," he'd said. "That's where the poison lives." And he was right. I found myself talking to them a lot, my parents. Not out loud, not in some dramatic way. But I'd pause by their portraits or sit in the garden where my mother used to prune the roses, and I'd think, "Are you proud? Did I do this right?" Because there's something brutal about being betrayed so intimately. It makes you question not just the people you trusted, but yourself. Your judgment. Your softness. The fact that you didn't see it coming. But I was starting to forgive myself. The court dates arrived like slow-moving trains, inevitable, clunky, and heavy with consequence. By the time the first hearing came, Brennan had already lost much of the public's sympathy. His former colleagues distanced themselves quietly, not with statements, but with silence. Law firms where he used to be a golden boy were suddenly restructuring or no longer involved in that matter. He was still living in our old guest house. He hadn't dared to return to the main house after everything came out. Delaney was a ghost by then. Her social media had gone dark. The nonprofit's phone lines were disconnected. And yet, the damage she left behind lingered like smoke. Women who had given to her foundation, believing they were helping others escape abusive relationships, started coming forward. Not all of them were angry. Some were just sad, disappointed. They'd believed in something that turned out to be a vanity scam. The prosecution added new evidence every week. Receipts, expense reports, altered tax documents, donor complaints. And then came the statements from former employees of the foundation, 2 women who'd been unpaid interns for months and had quietly left after realizing the charity was a facade. One of them had recorded a conversation. In it, Delaney laughed and said, "Most of these donors just want to feel like they're doing something. We give them a story, and they write the checks." That clip made it into the courtroom. And the room went cold. Brennan looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. His suits didn't fit the same. His posture sagged. At one point during the proceedings, he tried to appeal to the judge with a speech about how he had intended to create positive change in the community and that the execution may have been flawed, but the intentions were always noble. The judge didn't even blink. My lawyer, Maura, calm as ever, slid an email onto the evidence screen, a thread between Brennan and Delaney from the early days of the trust. In it, Brennan wrote, "If we structure it this way, she won't notice for a year at least. By then, it's untouchable." She was me. There was no coming back from that. In Charleston, word travels fast and memory is long. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about who he pretended to be. A man who gave speeches about ethics. A man who talked about lifting women up, supporting survivors, giving back. He played the role well, until the curtain fell and there was nothing left but arrogance and dust. The court ordered him to pay restitution. Delaney, too. Most of what they'd stolen was recoverable, thanks to the offshore account freeze. I wouldn't get back every cent of my inheritance, but I'd get enough. But truthfully, by then, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. About not letting them walk away with their lies still intact. After one hearing, outside the courthouse, a reporter from a local news station tried to get a comment from Brennan. She asked, "Do you regret anything?" He looked straight into the camera and said, "I regret trusting the wrong people." That was the moment I knew he was beyond help. Even after everything, after being exposed publicly, sued, shunned, and disbarred, he still couldn't take responsibility. He still thought I was the mistake. There were quieter consequences, too, the kind that don't make headlines but leave scars just the same. The old couples we used to have dinner with stopped calling him. His firm released a bland press statement about parting ways amicably. His own sister, who used to send me birthday cards every year, wrote me a letter. She said she had no idea what he was capable of. That she believed me. That she was sorry for staying silent when she first heard rumors. And the best friend who introduced us? Jackson. He sent a bottle of wine and a note that read, "I wish I had known." He lied to me too. I didn't reply. At one point, maybe 3 months into the legal mess, Brennan showed up at the house. He didn't knock. He had a key. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I heard the door open and the creak of old hardwood floors. I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. He walked in like he still had a place there, like nothing had happened. He looked around, at the antique cabinet, the velvet drapes, the oil paintings of my great-grandparents. He looked at me, then said, "This place feels empty without me." I stirred my coffee, not looking at him. He walked a few steps closer, and in a quieter voice said, "You didn't have to do it this way." I finally looked at him. "You did," I said. "You left me no other choice." He didn't argue. He just stood there, as if waiting for something. An apology? A moment of nostalgia? Maybe he thought I'd cry or ask him to leave in a rage. But I didn't. I simply said, "Lock the door on your way out." And I turned my back to him. I never saw him in the house again. But it wasn't over. Not really. Because when the legal noise died down, I was left with the quiet. And quiet has a way of making you look inward. The quiet that came after everything, the court battles, the headlines, the betrayal, was both a relief and a test. For weeks, I'd been operating on pure adrenaline. My days were full of lawyers and press calls and tracking down financial records, and now, for the first time, my phone didn't buzz every 5 minutes. There was no hearing to prepare for. No scandal brewing online. Just me, my coffee, and the creak of a very old house. And Maisie, my greyhound. I'd almost forgotten about her in all this. Brennan had taken her when he left, claimed she'd be less stressed with him in the guest house. Once everything fell apart, she somehow found her way back to me, brought over by his sister, of all people, who showed up quietly one morning and said, "She misses you." Maisie laid her head on my lap and sighed like she, too, was glad the storm had passed. But for all that peace, there was still a hollow space inside me. Not because I missed Brennan, not even a little, but because I'd spent so long being deceived that I didn't know what to do with honesty anymore. I kept expecting another shoe to drop. Then something unexpected happened. People started reaching out, not with pity, but with purpose. Former donors to her Light Foundation, mostly women, many of them older, emailed or called to ask if I'd ever considered starting something new. Something real. A fund, a nonprofit, even just a space where other women who'd been manipulated financially, whether in marriage, business, or family, could find support. At first, I was hesitant. The last thing I wanted was to be the public face of a cause. But the more stories I heard, the more I realized this wasn't rare. It wasn't just me. There were dozens of women, right here in Charleston, who had been quietly picked apart by charming men in ties and sweetheart investors. So I did something that Brennan and Delaney never could. I built something real. I called it the Marigold Trust, named after my mother's favorite flower. It wasn't flashy. It didn't host red carpet galas. It didn't pretend to change the world overnight. But it offered pro bono legal consultations to women who'd been financially manipulated. It helped them find the right kind of accountant, lawyer, or advisor. It gave them a safe place to ask questions they'd been too ashamed to ask out loud. And it partnered with small, verified shelters and women-led community programs across South Carolina. The ones doing quiet, honest work. No overhead siphoning. No photo ops. It grew slowly, but steadily. One of the first donors was a woman who had once hosted a brunch for Brennan and Delaney. She wrote a $20,000 check with a note that said, "For what it's worth, I believe you saved more than just your own name." And as for Brennan? The last I heard, he moved to Tallahassee. He changed his last name, slightly. Just enough to not raise eyebrows. His law license was officially revoked. Disbarred in both South Carolina and Georgia. I don't know what he does now. I heard a rumor he was working in risk management for a small logistics company. Appropriate, in a way. He's now a man whose entire job is preventing disasters. Fitting, since he became one. Delaney, on the other hand, fled further. She's somewhere in Arizona, last I heard, trying to rebrand herself as a wellness mentor. The internet doesn't forget, though. Every time she tries to launch something, the documentary resurfaces. Comments flood in. People know. They always know. About 6 months after the court case closed, I hosted a small open house at the Marigold Trust. No press. No fanfare. Just a gathering of women who had supported me, or who'd been supported in turn. Over tea and lemon bars, someone asked me if I ever regretted exposing Brennan so publicly. I thought about it. About how easily I could have handled it privately. How I could have tried to spare myself the attention, the whispered gossip at dinner parties. I could have walked away with a quiet settlement and a new financial advisor. But no. I didn't regret it. Because people like Brennan and Delaney don't stop because they're ashamed. They stop because they're seen. I leaned back in my chair, looked out over the garden we'd planted out front, rows of bright orange marigolds, and said, "He thought he stole my future. But all he did was give me back my power." The woman smiled. "Good," she said. "Because sometimes revenge isn't about hurting them. It's about rebuilding something so real they can't touch it." And that was the most satisfying part of all. No yelling. No fire. No chaos. Just the quiet strength of truth, and the life I rebuilt from it.